And joining us now from Toronto is Rosemary Sullivan. Thanks so much for being on the CJN Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's really great to talk to you. And I know our listeners and viewers have been either reading about the new book about the betrayal of Anne Frank since the publicity started back a couple of weeks ago. And I wanted to ask you, if anyone tuned in last week to the Jewish Community Center's virtual storyteller, they would have seen Heather Reisman and you and the chief investigator have a chance to speak to the Canadian audience. I wonder, was this the first time that you were able to sort of address all the controversy in a Canadian context? I don't know whether you've had chances before, but in such a Jewish Canadian context.
In a Canadian context, probably that was the first, though I have had interviews with New Zealand, Australia, France, certainly a number in the United States, and been able to confront the complexity of the response to the book.
Is the Canadian response any different than what you've been receiving elsewhere around the world, as you just mentioned?
Well, I could say that because I'm known as a Canadian author, and I would presume have a reputation for a degree of integrity because of the biographies I've done of, say, Elizabeth Smart and Gwen McEwen and Margaret Atwood, and then later Villa Erbel and Stalin's Daughter, which was astonishingly the recipient of a number of prizes. It would be assumed that I began the investigation and my involvement with the investigation with a degree of commitment and pursued things as seriously as I could. There has been some question about motivation that has come out of the Netherlands, for instance. Why a book about the betrayal of Anne Frank? Is it sheer opportunism? I think it was the interviewer on 60 Minutes who kind of said, well, he understood Vince Pankoch's motives and he understood my motives, but he was suspicious of the initial impulse behind the project to investigate the betrayal of Anne Frank. So I would say I feel more comfortable with my Canadian audience, and I think they understand that the book is really relevant now, because while the initial idea was to decide how and what happened on August 4th, 1944, that the people in the annex were discovered and arrested. Was it a phone call from an informant? Was it a happenstance, etc.? It soon became something larger, I feel, or larger is not the right word, something that accompanied this concern, which was, what is it like to live under military occupation and how does it happen? For me, it was very important. I had to convince the investigative team of my strategy, but it was very important for me to have a portrait of Otto Frank, the Frank family. And that moment in 1933, that soon, when he's at dinner with his wife and friends, and they hear that Hitler has been appointed chancellor, and the friends say, let's see what the man can do. And you go from that moment, which we've had in this contemporary world, to the all-out war and living in a society that is plagued by betrayal, terror, fear, silence, who can you trust, etc. So as it turns out, as we'll certainly discuss a little further on, the fact that it seems likely that the betrayer, so-called, the person who gave the address of the annex, was a Jewish notary. He was as much a victim as anybody else. Who can judge somebody who knows that their family is going to be sent to an extermination camp? And you have a list of addresses, no names. You don't even know what is behind those addresses. Possibly you convince yourself that people will have moved on. But how could you judge such a man? So the controversy that has arisen over the identity of the betrayer, I think, is misplaced. I think the issue is how, as we see with Putin, how do you get that level of violence supported by an army, a populace, and people seem to be almost numb to it. It's shocking.
You came into the project a couple of years after they originally began. What was your sort of requirements, or you said to them, only if this and this will I take it on?
I was told by my agent, Jackie Kaiser, that, or perhaps it was the publisher, the editor, who said to me, HarperCollins, the director of HarperCollins, Jonathan, has asked me to ask you if you would be interested in this project. That in itself was confirming, because I had done all my books with HarperCollins. And so my impulse was, well, let's see what this is. And then I contacted Thijs and Peter, and we discussed their motivations for doing this project. Then I flew to Amsterdam and met Vince Pankow, and the cumulative impact of that, I thought, this is a very serious investigation. I've never done anything quite like this before. I've always been entirely responsible for my own research. I did all the research, for instance, with Stalin's daughter, and had some extraordinary experiences. And the subtext of biography is almost more interesting than the biography, what you go through in your search for that information.
How do you deal with, critics, historians, and people that say, no, this isn't right. And then you have to be proving it. So you had 30 pages of endnotes.
Well, as I say, this was a completely different experience, because it wasn't just Thijs Bayens, Peter Van Twisk, and Vince Pankow. It was a whole slew of investigators, whether they were professionals from the forensic departments of the Dutch police, linguists, typeface specialists, psychoanalysts, etc. And then there were the whole slew of young women, mostly, though there were a couple of young men, researchers doing their postdocs, or who were already accredited historians. So there was, at one point, there were 23 people involved. So my dilemma was not where the information came from and so on. It was to actually find a narrative that made the information coherent. I did feel that the integrity of the information was dependent on them and not on me. And then I met Vince Pankow, and he's like a nice grandfather. You have no idea that this is the man who was involved in Colombian drug raids and Wall Street shenanigans and so on. And he had the black and white mentality, I have to say, of a certain kind of investigator, which, he believes in evil and he believes in good. And I found myself trusting his research, which was impeccable. Now, what they did, as you probably know by now, was Vince set up these projects, which he called the Resonance Project, the Arrest Warrant Project, the Statements Project, the Tracking Project, and each of these, each of the suspects they came up with, 30 at the beginning, which they narrowed down to about 12, which they narrowed to 4. They would look at these issues. For instance, residence projects, you discuss who lived where around the annex. Now, what makes this a different investigation? If you're a historian, and I've been an academic for 35 years, you are dealing not with the kind of information that a police investigation would undertake. I can't imagine to this day any of the specialists whose work we consulted actually having a resonance tracking project. You needed a database, and then you needed an AI platform to determine that. So Vince was able to, with Peter Van Twisk and with Brandon Rook, one of the Australian International Court volunteers were able to locate where the NSB lived, members, where known informants lived. You know, around the corner in a bicycle shop, there was a known informant. Down the street was, you know, so they were looking at information that isn't like the information that the academics search for. And I found the issue of an investigation of that kind really interesting. For instance, certain things might appear circumstantial, but you're putting together a puzzle. And when all the pieces of the puzzle are put together, maybe you can come up with a conclusion.
Some people, when they're writing books, have like a portrait of somebody beside them, or they have some kind of music playing or something that sort of marks that entire journey of writing the process. Did you have something like that? And what was it?
You know, for me, the writing is the process. You know, I did expect, but I didn't really think it through, the response that the book would generate. For me, the challenge, and it was huge, of trying to make a coherent narrative out of all these pieces. So if I have anything that is my guiding, it's my computer screen as I'm trying to put chapter after chapter after chapter together. And I get attached to one thing. And the one thing that I was attached to was the opening of the book, the raid and the green policeman. I'm going to actually impose on you and tell you I want to read a little bit from that. Would that be okay?
Sure.
I mean, it's just that it seems to me so significant that
So is that your screensaver, that the pictures of the green policeman and the raid, or did you have something on that computer screen that you looked at every day when you were writing it, or over? That's what I was sort of getting at, but maybe
no.
not.
The answer is no. It's hard enough. It's a incredibly painful subject. There were moments where, you know, I was close to tears. The idea of the people, there's a wonderful book, which is the accounts by 6 women who encountered Anne Frank. And the last one,
that book.
which
I have that
says,
book, yeah.
it's easy to die alone in a concentration camp. My God, what else can you say? So I couldn't have borne having something on my screen, frankly, because it was all too painful as it was. But this is where we get Otto Frank's account of the raid. It's one of the few instances where I could actually quote Otto Frank, because I wasn't given permission to quote him. In this case, Otto Frank is describing to the journalist, writer, Ernst Schnabel in 1957, what happened during the raid. And his description is so poignant because he remembers that he was giving Peter Van Pels, you know, who was 17 and then 19, he was giving him a lesson in grammar, and he was spelling double incorrectly. In English, there's only one, you know, B, and suddenly there's a man with a gun. But the thing that's shocking is the response of the SD, the German intelligence officer, Karl Silberbauer, who in 1963, from 45 to 63, in 1963, he's finally tracked down, and he is interviewed by a young journalist, Huff. And Silberbauer replies, "The people I took from their hiding place did not leave an impression on me. It would have been different if it had been a man such as General de Gaulle, or some major resistance member or other. Such a thing you don't forget. If I wasn't on the clock at that moment, my colleague got a call. I would never have come in contact with that Anne Frank. I still remember that I was just about to go out to eat something, and because the whole case blew up after the war, I am the one dealing with this mess. I wonder who is behind all this. Probably that Wiesenthal or someone on the ministry, at the ministry, trying to gain the favor of the Jews. It's hard to imagine this is me, a more despicable, emotionally cauterized response. By now, Silberbauer knew very well that Anne Frank, whom he'd arrested on August 4th, 1944, had died of starvation and typhus in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. It was as if what mattered was not the dead child. She is incidental, not real. Her suffering is insignificant, but he is the victim. And to me, that duality of the suffering on the one hand and the indifference and the self-indulgence, you know, and we're living it now.
I've heard you say read it before. I've read the book. It's still hard to process, and you know, even today, as you said, watching what's happening in Ukraine. But I want to pivot back towards some of the things that the researchers and filmmakers have said post publication.
Right.
The lead researcher said he's working on a reaction to the criticism. This was in a Dutch language newspaper. What does that mean? What is he doing? Do you know?
Yes, he's done it. He's created a blog in Dutch in which he's responded to the major criticisms. The major criticisms is that there are no tangible, physical, hold in your hands lists of hiding places. So how do we know there were hiding places? I have to backtrack for your readers, perhaps, or for the few who may not know, yeah, that in 1945, when Otto Frank returned from Auschwitz, he found a note addressed to him, and in the note was it was anonymous, and it said, "Your hiding place was betrayed to the Center for Jewish Immigration by Arnold Vandenberg of such and such an address." The one critic said that note wasn't delivered until 1957, when there is a letter from, I think it's Kugler, it might be Clement, I think it was Kugler, who says—
Kugler, by the way, moved to Toronto and lived in Canada. He was one of the people that helped hide them. Anyway,
yeah.
Go ahead.
One of the hiders said, who would send a note at such a time? And so the scholar assumed that the note had just come. But in fact, they had failed to check the police investigative report in 1963, in which the detective Van Helden, in his 40-page summary, speaks of the note that Otto Frank said he got just after returning from Auschwitz. He doesn't say what date, but he gave Van Helden a copy of the note. So there are errors that have been directed at us, which we haven't made, and so on. So Peter put together a response, as did Vince, to this issue of did lists exist? And I think people are are not entering the reality of 1944 August. It was, the war was winding down. It was clear to a lot of people that the Germans were losing. In particular, there was a sense that that a lot of the IVB4, the 4B4 Jew hunting unit, Dutch policemen, had to cover their act. They had to do things so that when the war was over, they wouldn't be considered traitors. It's very likely that one of them may have given a list of addresses to Vandenberg as a way of protecting himself. There's a guy called Mosbergen who was known to have lists of addresses. There were references to lists of addresses, etc. So the fact that a physical list doesn't exist is not an indication that there wasn't a list.
Back to what I just asked.
That's the one. And then the second issue is it some kind of anti-Semitism on the part of the investigative team that they focus on Arnold Vandenberg, because it's a case that wouldn't hold up in a court of law. You know, it's probably 85 to 90% credible, but there's always the possibility that there's an error made somewhere. And what the critics aren't taking into account, I think, is the double-sidedness of this search. On the one hand, there is the existence of this anonymous note. It made a big difference when Vince realized that what was being said was your address was given, not your name. So addresses, but then the other side of the equation is Otto Frank's response. And that's very moving. Otto Frank, I mean, there was nobody you could trust more than Miep Gies, frankly. I mean, her integrity cannot be put into doubt. That moment where she describes giving the diary back to Otto Frank when he returns in 1945, having saved it to give it back to Anne. And she knows that Otto has said to her, they're not coming back. When she gives it to him, a look passes between them that she says only happens once in a lifetime. And the same thing happened earlier when he asked her if she would help him hide. So Miep Gies tells Father John Neumann, a Catholic priest, at the Academy Awards for Miep's book, the Anne Frank Remembered. She tells him that Otto Frank knew who the betrayer was, and that she knew who the betrayer was. On another occasion, she says that in public that the betrayer was dead by 1960. These little snippets would slip out. Now, if Otto Frank knew who the betrayer was, why didn't he say, etc. So that, without Otto Frank's response, it's an anonymous note. But with Otto Frank's response, it's Arnold Vandenberg died in 1950. I'm not Jewish. I don't know what it is like to live in a family like that, but my dear friend described how her mother lived in a small town in Poland, and all the Jews were collected and they were sent into a field to run, and they were shot. And a friend of hers came and saw that she was alive and said, no, she's dead. And on that basis, she escaped. But what was compelling is that the life she lived after that, if Kitty hurt her knee, she couldn't tell her mother because her mother was so terrified of pain. When her father wanted to give her swimming lessons, her mother said she might drown. I mean, there are ongoing repercussions to this kind of thing. So why wouldn't Otto Frank want to close that door? There didn't need to be, he was not a man who was interested in revenge. He thought that, he told Miep Gies that he didn't want to hurt Vandenberg's children. Though she would have said he didn't want to hurt the betrayer's children. She never, ever used the name Vandenberg, nor did Otto Frank. But this is not the issue. If people disagree with the book, fine. Yeah, it's their prerogative. And in fact, there should be a conversation. What the shock is that the publisher, the Dutch publisher, Amble Athos, apologizes for the book and puts in their apology, we apologize to anyone who is offended by this book. Anyone? Are the fascists offended by this? I mean, give me a, And then they say to Peter and Vince, we officially apologize, but we still support the book and the investigation. So how's that possible? All right, and when Peter and they say that they consulted us, which they never did. We were never asked to defend the book. This blog was set up separately. And then they said, well, let's have a meeting. It was supposed to be last Wednesday. As a courtesy, Peter took down the blog. And suddenly on Wednesday, the commercial director was sick and the editorial publishing director went on holiday. So, and Amble Athos continues to sell the book. Now, if they believe that this book is insufficiently supported by evidence and has offended people, they should stop selling it.
They're selling it for €2.99, €2.99 in bookstores outside of Amsterdam. I have pictures of one of them. I can send it to you, which is nothing. Yeah. Did you? So I read that you didn't make much money on this yourself, and how much of your own personal money did you invest in writing the book? Because I know lots of authors do that.
No, I didn't make much money. For 3 years of work, which it was, I was making maybe $30,000 a year, which is not a lot of money. but my expenses were paid for, which would have been my trip to Amsterdam. And I was put up by the Society of the Dutch Writers in a beautiful apartment downtown, and then expecting to go continuously to Amsterdam, but the pandemic prevented that. So most of my work was via Zoom, I had access to the bookcase, which had something like 7,000 files, 66 gigabytes of material. And constant, I have tens of thousands of letters that come from researchers, not just the three major researchers, but other researchers, the young women who worked with me. I really, it'll be a long time before anybody makes further money from this project because of the expense of the project. No expense was spared. There were trips to Germany, to in the United States, etc. I don't think Vince made money. Everybody had their expenses paid for. But to think, I think my agent said the Americans would have to sell 500,000 copies before I would ever make any royalty. And then there would be an issue of the books they would hold, or the returns. So it'd be a few years.
But in terms of what's coming next, I read the German version is going to be published with revised and annotated pages. Are you involved with this? And what did they ask you? What questions did they ask you guys to fix?
Now, I haven't heard revised and annotated pages. What I have heard is that it will begin with Peter's preface, replacing mine, which is about arriving in Amsterdam. And it's a very good preface, a very serious preface. And it will have an afterword, which will be Vince and Peter's rebuttal. And I will be asked to elaborate more than, anything else. I haven't heard of any other changes. I will say I've never been so carelessly treated by a publisher as Athos, Ambos Athos. They were not happy with the whole issue of the 72% of the population, the Jewish population, of being deported. Of 107,000 people who were deported, 5,500 returned. Of the 25 to 27,000 people who went into hiding, 1/3 were betrayed. It's painful. It's like Canada having to deal with our reparation issues and so on. It's painful, but you've got to face it. But
Amsterdam just came out. Amsterdam just came out last year with the Wall of Names, and they have done. There was a big ceremony, and in fact, the City of Amsterdam gave the researchers for your book and the project, I should say, 100,000 euros, which they now are hoping to get back. What do you know about that? Yeah. Yeah, it's all in the Dutch newspapers. 2 city councillors have launched an investigation, the one for culture and the other one, and they want the money back. You hadn't heard about
people
that?
Are making comments on the basis of hearsay. They haven't read the book, I find we live in an age where people aren't willing to investigate the truth. They will make a comment from the top of their, I don't know. But anyway, what I was going to say is then eventually Ambos Athos said, oh no, all we're changing are things that the Dutch already know. For instance, where the train station is or something like that. I said, well, I still like a list. I never got a list. They said that they loved the book. They really, the agent, Marianne Schoenbach, sent a letter. She said, oh, it's so wonderful. They just love the book. And then the minute there were criticisms from the very vocal Dutch specialists, then they backed down completely. It takes a lot of
call this invading turf syndrome, I'm going to coin it that way, but that's something that I think I understood from your interview with Indigo.
Wonderful, very well-known doctor friend of mine said, oh, I recognize it. It's the acute violated turf syndrome. um, you know, but that's a conversation should be had, not this hysterical response, because this is, as you saw with Heather Reisman, this is a book that is a moving account of what it's like to live in a world where untruth is weaponized, you know, where fascism is mainstreamed, fear dictates how people relate to each other, and you can't trust anyone. So let's stop short of that, because we are moving in that direction.
Some wise person that I respect always said, as long, and it's like, don't call me late for dinner. As long as they're talking about you, it doesn't matter how, just as long as they're talking about you, right? So,
Well, I would rather they not talk in this way. It's not, frankly, it's, I want to say this right. It doesn't damage me. I did my work. I wrote, I think, a moving book. The persons that are most hurt by this would be Peter Van Twist, who thinks that now he may never be able to make a living in Amsterdam again because of this level of vehemence and that's been directed, and much of it for the wrong reasons.
what is the worst hate mail so far you've received since the book came out, or email? Yeah.
The one you would expect. So now you have encouraged anti-Semitism. I've had only 3 or 4. I've had dozens of positive letters, but one woman wrote that her mother had been a survivor of Auschwitz, and she'd read many of these stories, and it was painful, period.